Welcome to the Reading the World Conversation Series. For those who are unfamiliar with the series, we bring authors and translators to campus to discuss their work. And this week, we're honored to have Margaret Carson and Sergio Chejfec with us to discuss My Two Worlds. And before I go on, I'd like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences, the National Endowment for the Arts, for supporting the series, and Richard Peake and the Department of Rare Books, Special Collections, and Preservation for sponsoring this event, and also providing us with this beautiful room. Margaret Carson translates contemporary poetry, fiction, and drama from Latin America. In addition to My Two Worlds, her recent translations include works by Virgilio Pinheiro, Griselda Gambaro, and Mercedes Rafe. Margaret teaches in the Modern Languages Department at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. And Sergio Chejfec was born in Buenos Aires. In the 90s and early 2000s, he lived in Venezuela, Caracas, where he published Nueva Sociedad, a journal of politics, cultural, and the social sciences. He currently lives in New York City and teaches in the creative writing and Spanish program at NYU. He's written numerous novels, essays, and a poetry collection. In addition to My Two Worlds, which we open letter publish, we're going to be publishing two more of his novels, The Dark and The Planets, in the next coming years. So I think what we're going to do is have Margaret do a short reading in English for My Two Worlds, and then Sergio's going to do a brief reading in Spanish, and then we're going to just have a conversation for a few minutes, and then open it up to questions. So Margaret, if you want to start, and maybe you want to start by describing the plot of the book or the structure of the book or something about it to give a little context for what we're going to be discussing also.
Sure, well,
Yeah?
Okay, so as I said, the narrator is walking around with thoughts, and he happens to run into, in the city, street vendors. And it triggers memories of other street vendors that he's seen before in other places. So I'm going to read from this section. Once I was in the downtown of another city and saw a street vendor being robbed. I suppose he had just begun to set up or was about to leave. In any event, he was leaning over some cardboard boxes with his back to the merchandise. A passerby noticed he wasn't paying attention, moved closer to the table, and carried off a bag of scarves or pashminas, whatever they're called. That caused me to reflect that street vendors are at their most vulnerable, or simply at their weakest, when they're setting up their goods or stowing them away. The street was busy, with people on all sides. And yet I was the only one who noticed what had happened. Even the victim himself, when he turned around, kept arranging his things as if nothing was wrong. A moment later, he sensed that something strange was going on because his display had changed. Things were missing, though he probably wasn't sure either. This tempted me to tell him he'd just been robbed, but I held off because I couldn't explain why I'd taken so long to say something to him. So I looked behind me, as I always do, and above the mass of pedestrians I saw, a block away, the person who had taken the bag, a rather tall man who every so often glanced sideways as he went down the street, in case there might be any danger in pursuit. As I've seen on other occasions, some vendors never stop unpacking and setting up their stand for the entire workday. They're the ones harassed by the police. They lay their merchandise on the ground or on a flimsy tarp, or hold a lightweight board in their hands, and are more on the lookout for a warning signal than for the approach of the unlikely customer. The police, in their zeal, can be quite meticulous. Several days before the one I've been recounting here, as I stood on a downtown corner in another Brazilian city, I watched 3 or 4 policemen chase off a vendor who, in his haste, left behind a wooden horse he'd clearly been using to support the board that held his merchandise. It was a solid horse, which resisted the kicks one policeman was giving it with all his might. Another policeman intervened and propped it diagonally against a tree trunk, so as to split the wood more easily. A strategy of no use either. Finally, as I was walking away, I saw 2 policemen jumping up and down on the horse, trying to break it up while the other officers looked on, engrossed by the operation, and no doubt intrigued by the object's resistance. I could go on with my reminiscences of street vendors. For instance, while living for a time in a provincial city, I encountered, on a daily basis, a woman who sold embroidered tablecloths and napkins. She didn't use a table, chair, or any other support, but stood on her perennial corner for hours, from midday until dusk, holding her goods in her arms and draped over her shoulders. She stepped forward timidly when she thought that a passerby, usually another woman, might be interested in her merchandise. Otherwise, she preferred to stand still, from time to time moving in circles to stretch her legs, I suppose. Seeing her walking like that, I was reminded of those picketers in the United States, usually few in number, who circle round and round in the same spot, as if their protest were a kind of punishment. Now and then, this woman was joined by another woman, who sewed flowers from a bouquet, one at a time perhaps, since no other bouquet was visible. She stood against the wall, as if sinking into it, and looked as if she were waiting for someone who wouldn't show up. The 2 of them made me wonder if some intermediate category existed to describe them, something between a street vendor and itinerant peddler. I remember that as I passed them, I tended to think of tango songs, the stories and scenes described in their soap opera-ish lyrics, perhaps a line at most. Or I would think of movies recounting the lives of long-suffering people set in another century or another era. People punished by poverty, victims of society and their neighbors, with no means of self-defense and survival other than their dignity. Pathetic, humiliating, and tragic stories. These belong to a long era that I had, I suspected, for the most part missed, though it was familiar to me, depending on how one defines familiar. Anyhow, it was a cultural era that I'd experienced, though only at its tail end, which might explain the flurry of songs and movies with such motifs, and in such a way that it had no deep or direct influence on me. And why hadn't it touched me more? Because I'd been privileged, I thought, that's why. The waves of evil and the world's tragedies, multiplied by the number of people who had suffered them and suffered them still, had ebbed, along with their sentimental effects, before they reached me. It was as if at that moment an inner voice had declared, "This guy, me, is spared. The misfortunes of the world didn't touch me."